We are in the book of Colossians due to a gospel meeting, lectureship, and then next week, Bible camp, and then the next week I have a gospel meeting. This will be the last time we're in Colossians for about 2 weeks. So we'll try to keep our minds of where we are. At least we'll try to do that as we pick back up in 2 weeks, and I'll try to give us a little reminder of where we have been. I want you to pick up with me in Colossians 3:18. And we spent time in this particular book a few weeks ago. It's been a while since we've been in this particular class. But we're in this particular section in Colossians chapter 3 that I believe this is the section that begins to conclude the book. Because we're going to talk about wives, we're going to talk about husbands, we're going to talk about children, and when we enter into chapter 4, we're going to talk about servants. And in all three of these categories, every area of life is going to be discussed. Every area of life is going to be discussed, and every avenue of life is going to be discussed. Especially when you bring your minds back to verses 16 and 17, and how he's making an implication that the Word of Christ has to dwell in us richly. It's the culmination of the end of this particular chapter. And I want us to pick up in verse 18, which is about where we left off a few weeks ago. And let's just read 18 through 20 to get the idea of what's happening. Here it is. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as it is fit in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and be not bitter against them. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. What we're going to do just briefly tonight, we're going to take all of those verses at once, and we'll just start at verse 18. And I want to ask you a question. What is the crucial word in verse 18? Many will say submit. I'm sorry, I heard you, but I didn't hear you. Pleasing. Your own, that's a good one. I think it's the word fit from verse 18. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe the phrase your own husband is crucially important. But if we're going to talk about marriage, what is marriage? Define marriage for me. One man, one woman, for how long? Life. That's why I choose fit. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as it is fit in the Lord. There is no doubt, I believe, if you start in the book of Genesis, and even if you wanted to read all the way to the end of the New Testament, that God has placed inside of His Word a high degree on the marital relationship. From the very beginning, man is to leave father and mother and cleave unto who? His wife. And you keep following marriage all throughout, and you'll see the importance there. But this is also a parallel passage in Ephesians 5:22 through 33, where Paul gives more detailed discussion about the relationship between the wives and the husbands. And we won't go into all those details there, but we will notice some things here in verse 18. Who is verse 18 talking about or talking to? Wives. Okay, real simple. First word. Wives. What are wives supposed to do according to verse 18? It's a word our society hates. Submit. Submit what? Yourself. Now, it would be very different, I believe, if verse 18 read, Wives, submit unto your own husbands. But I believe every word is very specific, don't you, inside of Scripture? Wives, submit what? How much of a wife is she supposed to submit to her husband? Some. Part. The easy stuff. Aren't there easy things to submit to your husband to? Oh yeah, there are, aren't there? Can we just pick the easy things? It's just like submitting to the Lord. Aren't there easy things to submit to the Lord to? I think there are, aren't there? And the same thing is true in marriage. There are things, wives, that would be easy to do. Is that all he's talking about, the easy things? Now, I think he includes the totality of it when he says, wives, submit yourselves, as in a word that means everything you got. And yes.
That doesn't mean that a wife can't have an opinion.
Yes, ma'am. That's right.
Can't voice her opinion.
That's right. I've always said, yes, I've always said of the word submit, this is not a word that says, go make me a sandwich. And I know that's funny, but I mean it seriously. Is that what the wife is for, to make her husband a sandwich?
No. I think the thrust of it means that the husband is supposed to be the leader.
There you go. There you go. Headship. And if you go into Ephesians chapter 5, 22 through 23, and I like to tell you to go to 21 to 33, if you go in that particular section, it's about his headship. Remember, Christ and the church, the husband and the wife. Same thing is being taught here. The Lord expects that the husband and wife relationship to be correct.
Over the centuries, man, in the man's world, they think the woman should take the back seat. They have all the say-so, and you just go along with the flow.
You know what the problem with that is? They think. One of the biggest things that gets us in trouble religiously is when we have a bright idea on our own. Same thing is true in marriage. You ever seen a husband get in trouble? Now, don't laugh, ladies, but he had a bright idea on his own. It may have been a great idea, but he had it on its own. We don't like to ask this question. I've never asked. You ever seen a wife get in trouble? I've never asked that out loud as an illustration. Same thing. Had an idea on their own. And that's what this particular scene is teaching us. It's a relationship here. Now, I normally would not say this again. We said it in the book of Ephesians, but I really want to hit this home. Unto your own husbands. What does our world think of marriage? Easy in, easy out, yeah. It's like you're driving down the interstate, you see the billboard for the wedding chapel, and then the next one you see is for the divorce attorney. That's how our world considers this. Have you watched TV commercials lately? How many of them are about divorce attorneys? You've probably ignored it. If you're like me, we DVR everything and fast forward through the commercials. But just pay attention next time. Lawyers are about two things. You've had an accident, you need to sue somebody, or you need a divorce. You just watch it.
Hey, John, I'd like to comment on this also. A lot of people today, when they read this verse, they won't sit here. They get up in your face about it.
Oh, yes.
Oh, wait a minute. I ain't submitting to nobody.
Mm-hmm.
Next time they'll say, well, this is an old text. This is nearly 2,000 years ago. We're in a whole different modern society.
Mm-hmm.
That's things that
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that before, and you know, every time somebody says that's just an old text, so I always say, so Jesus isn't relevant? So salvation doesn't exist anymore?
The rules of a godly marriage haven't changed.
No, they've not. It's just the same as the rules of the Lord's church have not changed. Why do you think modern worship exists? It's just an old book. Therefore, we can let the rules slide back. There's a God, but He's letting us worship. Same thing is true with marriage. And I find it really impressive. I wonder when they read this the first time, did they think anything of your own husbands? Probably would have, because in the day in which they lived, the adulterous temples of worship were about adultery. The marital relationship was in question.
If they don't love each other, why did they get married in the first place?
Can't answer that for you. But I want to center in on this phrase before we move from verse 18 and go into the section about husbands. As it's fit in the Lord, as God has designed it, is how this conclusion of this book is preparing to end. As God, as it is fit, as it is right, as it is in the design of God. One man, one woman for life. Verse 19, he pulls to the husband's side. Husbands, who's this verse written to? Now, let me ask you a question. Does verse 19 exclude anyone? Does verse 19 exclude anyone? It doesn't exclude the husbands. So who's it got to exclude? Well, wives. Can we make verse 19 about wives? I can't, can I? Who's it written to? Husbands. Husbands. Now, it's interesting to me. It's interesting to me that men have to be told this. Husbands, love your wives. You really could, couldn't you? And that's the society we live in. Wives, love your husbands. But husbands, love your wives and be not bitter against them. It's clear and emphatic information given here about the responsibilities of the husband. He's supposed to nurture the relationship of which they have. If you bring your minds back to Ephesians 5:21 through 33, what did Christ do for the church? Matter of fact, it says, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. What do you think the implication here is? Husbands, love your wives.
Here, I'm going to throw you one another. If a husband loved his wife like Christ loved the church, do you think the women would have any problem submitting to that husband?
Exactly. And I'll throw you another one. If the husband loved his wife as Christ loved the church, what about adultery? Wouldn't exist, would it? That's an interesting parallel we never want to make.
I don't believe if a husband doesn't love his wife, as the Bible teaches, he can't be in communion with Christ.
I agree with you. That's how important the institution of the home and the institution of the church is. And that's why I constantly say if we can get the home right, the rest of it's going to fall into play. But he says something that's very impressive to me in verse 19. It's the ending. I think the crucial word is not of verse 19. Husbands, love your wives and be not, what? Bitter against who? Your wife. Husbands are not to be bitter toward their wives. What's it mean to be bitter? Let me ask this of the entire group of men and women. Have you ever been bitter toward someone? You ever been left with a bad taste in your mouth? If you won't answer it, I'll answer it for all of us. Yes. What'd that make you do? Undercut, undermine, withdraw from. Yeah, that's a good phrase. But it's interesting that verse 19 is not talking about what the wife has been doing or is going to do. It's talking about what the husband is doing. Isn't it interesting? Verse 19 does not say, you set her straight. But it says you set yourself straight. Verse 19 says, husband, be the husband. Verse 18 says, wives, be the wife. Now look at verse 20, verse 20. Children, what comes out of marriage? Children. That's a simple mathematical or English lesson, but A plus B equals what? Y'all get it. Y'all understand. Verse 20, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord.
I think you're leaving out two important words.
It's built into the text. If children obey their parents, do they respect them and have their parents give them responsibility? I'm a firm believer in giving children responsibility. We don't do that anymore as a society, do we? We're a give me society. They ask, we give. I think we're harming them more than we are by doing those things. I'll say this, and I'll quit harping about this, but we also live in a trophy society. Everybody gets a trophy. I think that harms our children. Most of the time for just being there. Responsibility and respect are built into this. Now, something also is built into this. Children, obey your parents in all things. What should parents be concerned about with their children? Or in what areas? Yes, you're 100% correct, but I want to say it this way. All things. Now, that's hard in the world we live, isn't it? Let me show you one of the things that's making that hard. Parents, let me warn you about something. Children aren't in here, so they won't like this, so tell them it was me. You need to see if your children have an app on their phone called Snapchat. They have just enabled a new feature in that application that allows the passing of pornography without you knowing it. Just released it. Need to check. It's hard. It's difficult. It is. It's. I don't know how the protocols are built into that. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good rule. That's a real good rule. I don't know all the legitimacies of how it works, but it does work.
First rule we need to have on those is children don't need them.
You're right.
People that have designed all this said they knew what it was going to do.
They do.
They did it anyway for the money.
They did. It's made billions.
Children can't even sit down and have a conversation with each other.
No, they can't. I'm going to admit this, and you may think bad of me, and please don't do that, but one of my favorite things on the internet is people walking on their cell phones and not watching where they're going and tripping and falling. Because this is what they're doing, and it's every security camera catches this stuff, and they put it online. Problems and problems. So parenting has changed. It's not just a written world anymore, it's an electronic world. And what that means is we've got to be advanced, we've got to be informed. I believe that's what all things mean. They didn't have this problem when this was written originally. They didn't have to worry about the social media account of their child. They had to worry about which street they were playing in, just as much as we still do. I was really excited this week to see kids riding the bicycle in the neighborhood this week. Old-fashioned. It's changed. Just my tidbit of information for you. Check on that. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. What's the key word of verse 20? Key word of verse 20. I used to think that, and I used to think all was, but I think it's pleasing. Because who is it pleasing? Can our children please the Lord? Yes, they can. This text tells us they can when they obey their parents in all things, for this is right. Now, there are parameters on that. And thus, when we roll into verse 21 and 22, we're going to see those parameters pull into play for us. Now, it's interesting. Notice this. Verse 20, children, obey your parents, father, mother. Verse 21, what's the first word? Father. Read the verse. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. Why did he write that to fathers? It is really easy to lay down the law, isn't it? That's easy to do. Very, very well true. Very well true. But being too stern and being overly demanding and being hard to please will drive a child to resentment. That's not a modern idea, that's a biblical idea. So what does that tell us about parenting? It's hard. You know that.
I had a lady that I had a Bible study with back a couple of years ago,
Mm-hmm.
And now she's working at General Motors and along with her daughter. And both of those are just about the most godly women you'd ever meet in your life. I sit down and have talks with them about the way they live, just, trying to set up a Bible study with them. They told me their parents were so strict on them that they swore when they hit the age of 18 they never set foot in church again. And when they did, that's what they did. They bar hop, they run around with men, they just, anything you
Yeah.
imagine, they do. Whatever rebellion leads to, they do.
I've heard that from young people before. I'm getting ready to go be with about 150 young people. Pray for me. For a week, and we got them. And I've heard that on more than one occasion. I just can't make them happy. I just can't make Daddy happy. What's the problem? Now, I'm not saying it's always the parent's fault, but can it be the parent's fault? Just as much as you just illustrated, we can take this to the opposite side and say, I can't make them come to church. I can't make them. Can you make your child come to church? Or should you teach them to love the Lord? It's a way we look at it. It's a difference in looking at things. Don't make them do anything. Teach them to love the Lord. If we can teach our children to love the Lord, we're not going to have to make them do anything. And I think that's where we many times go wrong. We put them through the motions.
The Bible also warns us in our day and age, children are going to start disrespecting their parents,
They're already doing it.
disrespecting society.
Already doing it.
Children are so much more advanced now than they were when my children
Yeah.
were children.
Yeah.
And they're just smart.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times we forget
Mm-hmm.
some of these kids, they're just 4 and 5 years old because they're so smart.
Yeah.
We forget that they're still just babies.
That's right. And that's one of the things we've got to remember. Children are what? Children. Children are children. They can be spoiled. But what are children? That's right. They can be spoiled or encouraged. But at the end of the day, children are children. And when we forget that fact, what do? I think this is the product of the conditioning of our society. Kids have to know more when they get to kindergarten now than they ever had. And I'm not knocking that. I'm glad that we're teaching our children real, and we're on target with it. I'm glad we're doing that. But one of the things that we do is we forget that they're just children. And that's a difficulty here in this particular scene. That's also 100%. If husband and wife, 18 and 19, are what they're supposed to be, 20 and 21 will lay into place, won't it? Now also remember this. When talking about children. Now I'm not a child expert. They're not alike. You're right. They're not. Would you believe that Colson slept 5 hours the other night? Boy, we couldn't get Charlie to do that for nothing. That's right. That's right. That's right. I was very excited tonight when we pulled in the parking lot. We just left Ivy Crest. Charlie was with me. And we pulled in the parking lot and we parked down toward the office side. Where are the people at? He knew people were supposed to be here on Wednesday night when we pulled in the parking lot. He's almost 3 and he knows that on Wednesday night where we got to be. Right here. Training. Lest there be discouraged. Have you ever been discouraged?
We all have at least a couple of times in our life.
Every person in this room. If you haven't been, you just buckle up because it's coming. Why would we expect children to deal with adult problems? Discouragement should be an adult problem, not a child problem.
But children watch everything we do or say.
Yes, they do.
They imitate that.
And that's when we make it a child problem. We, father, mother, all of us, lest they be discouraged. I think the key word of verse 21 is discouraged. You want to run your child away from eternity? Discourage them from going to eternity. There's two ways we can do that. We could be hypocrites, go to church and not be who we're supposed to be, or we can be overbearing and discourage them from being who they're supposed to be. Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, yeah. I think so. That's right. I remember distinctively the first time I whipped Charlie. We were in Lawrenceburg. We were out in the middle of town, and I took him outside and whipped him. He cried, I cried, we all cried. But one of the things I promised, Kelly and I discussed this, and we promised we would do every time we spank our children, was to tell them why. Tell them why. Communication can be just as much a problem in marriage as it is with children. And I think we forget that. I'm glad you brought that up, Amy. That's really good to add here. Now, it's interesting as he prepares to kind of transition in verse 22. Look at the word of verse 22. 4 categories. Servants. We're transitioning out of husband, wife, and children into servants. And it reads this way, verse 22, servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. Now, what does the word servant in Colossians 3:22 mean? Does it just mean a waiter? That's right. The Greek word means slaves. Now, we are blessed to not be slaves to someone physically, aren't we? But it has happened in our world, hasn't it, over the history of the world? Now, this is a very interesting thing. Notice he didn't tell them to run. I find that impressive, don't you? He said, you be a good laborer. You be a good laborer. Now, we can't sit here and say we know anything about slavery because, well, we've never experienced that. But here's what we know. If we ever become a slave to someone, I'll work for the Lord. That's the implication he's making here. Obey in all things your masters. Now notice this, according to the flesh. You do your work. You do your work according to the flesh, the physical things. But notice he didn't say obey your master according to the Spirit. He didn't say in spiritual things. And notice this is impressive. And this we can make application to us in this area. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, respecting or fearing God. We can make the same application to the employee-employer relationship. You ever seen that person? You've probably met them, the coworker that tried to do as little as possible. Or tried to find ways to look busy so they didn't have to be busy. I worked with a fella who would get a notebook or a binder and just walk around. As long as he had something in his hand looking busy, he was busy. And he spent his days sometimes just wandering around, doodling on a pad. He looked busy. And that was his thing. I need to look busy.
Where's the boss checking work?
Yeah, well, that's not what this verse is talking about, is it? Don't just be there to be there to be a laborer. Same thing is true in the employer-employee relationship.
What about the guy, you see these guys, be working somewhere on the line. Nobody working, nobody doing that. Boss goes to work, walking up.
Everybody's busy. Everybody's busy. That, my friend, would be a man pleaser, men pleasers. Doing it just for the recognition and not doing it for, look at verse 22, the respect of God. That tells us something. In our labors, what is God doing? He's inspecting. But in singleness of heart, fearing God. And then he makes this transition in this particular section down to the end of the chapter. And whatsoever you do, do it heartily as unto the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ, But he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. What's the end of this particular section saying? And I believe it ties into husbands, wives, children, servants. As he's going to come back to chapter 4, verse 1, masters. Every area of life is going to be covered in this concluding statements. I believe the chapter division here throws us off. We see chapter 3, we get to verse 25, we're done. We got to keep on going. Everything's going to be covered here. What's he saying? In everything that we do, verse 23, I do it heartily, I do it with great care, I do it with great consideration, as if I were doing it for the Lord himself. Boy, what would employment look like if we did everything that we did as if the Lord had asked us to? Wouldn't have a lot of those rolled eyes, or would we?
Back to where you had your women, your wives,
Yeah.
your husbands. Supposing the wives submit to the husbands like they would if they were submitted.
To Christ. That's right.
What if husbands love the wives like they would love Christ?
Yeah.
What if children obey their parents as
They
they
love-
obey Christ?
That's right.
I think that's what they're talking
That's the illustration being made here. What if we did everything in life as if it were for the Lord? Wouldn't that be different? Wouldn't we be different? I think the answer is yes. Especially the ending of verse 23, as to the Lord, now listen to this, and not unto who? Men. Not unto one another, but to the Lord. And then he makes this illustration and application in 24 and 25 as he's preparing to transition to the fourth area of life. There is a reward, there is an inheritance that comes from Christ. And guess what? Verse 25, your life truly matters. For he that doeth wrong, what's wrong? Sin. For he that is involved in sin shall receive for the sin which he hath done, and there's no respect of persons. God's not going to treat you differently as he treats me, and God's not going to treat us differently as he treated those that read it the first time. That brings us back to it's an old document, just 2,000-year-old document. It doesn't apply anymore. Oh, it does, because it's the standard of judgment. And thus he prepares in this particular section to transfer us into our minds into chapter 4, but we're going from wives, husbands, children. Chapter 4, verse 1, masters. Now, there's a lot of discussion among the theologians of the world, the commentators of the world, about masters. What's the master here? That's what some say. What's the master? One in authority. One in authority. You'll find two or three different things if you go to look at commentaries on Colossians 4, verse 1, especially with the word masters. You're going to find some people who say it is one in authority, and that's what I believe the statement means. One who is under or in a position of authority, one who can give out requirements or demands. Number two, you're going to find people who are going to say this is implicitly and exclusively slave owners. And then some are going to say a few different things in this particular scene. It's one who is in authority. That's right. They had servants. Whether we're talking about servants who were owned as in slaves or servants who were servants of the household. I think there's a difference in that statement. But if you look at it as one who is giving out authority in that aspect, we start to get an application that we can make to ourselves.
So your master is also your employer.
That's right, your employer, exactly, one in authority. Masters also could be, who's in authority in the New Testament church? Christ. But who is he set to be in a position of authority in the church? Okay. I think we can make that application of here. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. Go down with me to verse 3. Continue in prayer and watch the same with thanksgiving, with all praying also for us, that God would open unto us a door of utterance to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in bonds. The reason I believe that chapter 4 division here is unnatural is because we go from wives, husbands, children, masters, into what happens into verse 2. I think if you're going to make a break in this particular section, it happens at chapter 4, verse 2. I believe the first section has to all go together, but that's not how they divided it. Give unto your servants that which is just and equal. How should we treat all people? As that it is just and equal. Doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter who they are. Rich or poor, how do you treat them? Justly and with equality. Black and white, how do you treat them? Justly and with equality. That's right, that's what he's saying here. But I think he makes an impact here in the ending of verse 1, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. You have one of which you look to for the authority in this particular scene. Christians are to treat all with equality inside of life. But he tells all Christians, all those being discussed here in verse 2, continue in prayer. Let me say something about verse 1 again before we leave this. Where is the master? Where is the true master located? Into verse 1. Your master in heaven. Where's our master? Where's our Lord? He's in heaven. Heaven. So keep that into your minds as we think about this particular section. Unfortunately, the bell has rung, which means we are out of time tonight. But I appreciate you participating in class tonight and spending time with us. We will pick back up. We'll miss the next 2 weeks of this class. And then we will pick back up right here as we pick up in verse 4. And as we start verse 4, we're going to continue to talk about these different admonitions that Paul is giving them. And when we start into verse 7 and make our way down to verse 14, we're going to talk about some of Paul's co-workers, and there's going to be some interesting people to make mention of there. One specifically is in verse 9, Onesimus. Trying to figure out who Onesimus is before we get to this particular section. And there are going to be some others that we need to make mind of. So the next time we gather together for this particular class in the book of Colossians, we will finish this class. So be prepared for the next 2 weeks to be out of this class. And then when we come back in 3 weeks, we'll pick right back up here in verse 4 and we'll finish the class. Thank you so much.